Okay, I had a suggestion from one of my friends that he wanted to see me do some short videos explaining some things like the First Seminole War. So anyway, that's kind of a good idea. I was planning of doing something like that anyway, and just didn't know where to start and jump off. So anyway, I recorded a couple videos to start, but I didn't like them. So yesterday I had to run an errand down to the Ocala forest. A friend was working out in the forest, needed some tools brought to him. So I went down there, and especially because where I was going, I was one of the few people who knew what his truck looked like and could find him right away, which I did. So that worked out. But anyway, the drive down there kind of got me in a little better mind of what I wanted to do with my video. First off, the background, the virtual background I had is a prescribed burn that I took part in Fakahatchee Strand State Park down in Southwest Florida on the edge of Big Cypress. That's photos from like 8 or 9 years ago. It's pretty neat. It's anyway. Um, I don't want to talk about the First Seminole War without telling about things that led up to it. There's kind of some disagreements between Seminole War historians on what caused it. And so I'll be tackling those. Uh, one of my friends said that it was the attack of Foultown and the Scott Massacre in 1817. Other people say that was the attack on Prospect Bluff Negro Fort and destroyed that. And then another of my friends came up with an interesting argument that it started with the attack in 12 Mile Swamp during the War of 1812 against the Marines and Patriots and Noonan's attack on King Painstown. So I'll be going through those, but first going back quite a little further, uh, the Seminole Indians have a very long history. They were not always called Seminole. They might be called something else, so Oconee or Tuckabatchee, the towns they originally came from. The word Seminole was uh, came about in the mid 1700s, 18th century, um, and what became the Seminoles were remnants from the other tribes, some of the Creek Confederacy, uh, the Hidjety speaking Miccosukee, and also there's some remnant that survived in Florida. One of the Seminole stories, oral history is very interesting, and I could do a whole hour on that. One story talks about that their impressions and what they saw when the Spanish first arrived. And then they even go further back than that. Do you know that in the Muskogee language, they have words for mastodon and saber-toothed tiger, and they describe Florida during the last ice age. So, and also stories about them going out in giant dugout canoes and trading with people out in the Gulf, out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. So that's very interesting. But I want to cover the historical aspect about there are many causes that put the Seminole, Miccosukee, Florida people, indigenous people, in conflict with the United States. Uh, One, we could say an issue of slavery that's very well known and been studied a lot in the past few years, that the escaped slaves finding refuge among the Seminoles. Another thing that was talked about quite a lot in 1995 during Florida's sesquicentennial 150th anniversary of statehood was the cattle industry in Florida that goes all the way back to the Spanish, and it was a control over cattle. There was a Seminole chief named Cowkeeper, and you can imagine yes, he did have a lot of cattle. One of the early cattle pioneers, Moses Barber, when he came down to Florida in 1819, he captured 2,000 heads of cattle that he got from the Seminoles. Um, so that's conflict between the settlers and the Seminoles. Um, when Florida became part of the United States, you had competition not only between cattle, livestock, also arable land where you can grow. There's many environmental impacts at that time. There's really bad freezes and then droughts that nobody could grow anything, so they kept raiding each other back and forth for food supplies. So anyway, the Seminoles have the problem of not always being on the winning side in the international theater of events. That uh, we know from time to time. Spain had Florida for a few centuries, then the British had for 20 years. Then Spain got it back for just a few years before the United States getting it. And each of those transactions were the result of a political action or other events that happened thousands of miles away sometimes. We even know about the French Huguenots trying to settle in Florida, and that got the Spanish to establish the colony of St. Augustine to get rid of the French. So the Seminoles made a treaty with the British at Piccolotto Landing in 1765. And on the treaty, it says cowkeeper uh, with the of the Alachua Seminoles, and that was with the British. They're establishing their peace and trade with the British. At that treaty, John Bartram and William Bartram, the famous naturalists, were present at that time and saw it going on and wrote about it. But of course, that was also the start of the British 20 years in Florida. The British got Florida from the Spanish at the end of the 7 Years' War. That the British had captured Cuba during the 7 Years' War, so the Spanish, to get that back, they gave Florida to the British. Well, Florida had always been a liability to the Spanish. They never really found any gold there, and the biggest resource they had was manpower by enslaving the indigenous people, who also suffered the disease. We know plenty of that time. If you ever get to Tallahassee, they have Mission Spanish Louise that covers the first Spanish period, about 50 years from, I think, about 1640 to when it was destroyed by the British raiding parties under Governor Moore of Carolinas in 1704, I believe. So anyway, the Seminoles made a treaty with the British at Piccolotto in 1765. And then, of course, the American Revolution happened there. And the British, as a result, because the Spanish sided with the United States, the British lost Florida and gave it back to the Spanish. So then the Seminoles were not so friendly. There's one British account saying that it's not safe to come out the gates of St. Augustine because the Indians will attack anyone that goes to the interior. And the reason why is they're not at all happy that the Spanish are coming back to Florida. The Spanish have a reputation on that. And you also had moving around of the native population, Eufaula Indians coming in from Georgia, Alabama, uh, other Muskogee speaking groups, Pidgety speaking groups, move further down in South Florida, Peace River area. And the British were actually encouraging these native people to move into Florida as a buffer against the Americans. The British always were good at using the native tribes against the other foreign powers, hiring them as mercenaries. The British were also very good at trading, had a big trade network going. So when the Spanish got Florida back, they established a trading supplies with the Indians, the Pant and Leslie store. So the Spanish employed British trading system to help with their dealings with Indians. Now, the British idea was to put the native people in debt and get them to sign away their land. So, yes, it was nice getting all those manufactured or modern goods, but it had a heavy price and they didn't come cheap. Anyway, there's a man who came onto the scene. His name was William Augustus Bowles. He was a Tory from Maryland. And let's see if I got a picture of him here. Here he is. He was born 1763 during the American Revolution. Uh, as a teenager, he is about 15 years old. He went AWOL or got in an argument with the captain of his company and deserted from the ship in Pensacola and ran off with the Indians, became native, as they say, eventually married two daughters, one Cherokee and one Creek. The group he joined up with was the William Perryman's town on the Chattahoochee River, and then came down and he also settled in Miccosukee town, which is near Lake Miccosukee, between Tallahassee and the town of Monticello to the east of Tallahassee. So William Augustus Bowles, he was well-educated artist, wrote his own biography. 3 times he tried to capture the Spanish fort St. Mark's. The first time he failed, and oh, by the way, after he jumped ship, that was about 1778, about 3 years later, he rallied the Indians once again on the British side and tried to defend Pensacola against the Spanish. He failed. The Spanish did capture Pensacola, but he went back in favor with the British and they gave him a pension. And also he became, he started working with the governor of the Bahamas, Lord Dunmore, who became his patron to establish a rival trading company against Panton and Leslie stores. So he was trying to take the business away from Panton and Leslie. In 1788, so he's 25 at that time, William Augustus Bowles proclaims himself Director General of the State of Muskogee, a self-proclaimed leader of the Seminoles and Creeks. Of course, he had no authority to do that. He just kind of did himself and established a country that really had no borders. He had a navy, but it was only 3 ships. And the British pretty much eventually considered him no more than a pirate, not even a privateer. So anyway, he tries to capture St. Mark's. He fails on that, and they loot the Panton Leslie store instead. That's 1792. And anyway, the Spanish end up capturing him and they put him on a prison ship. And this is totally wild what happens next. They send him to prison in the Philippines. And there's a change of government or in Spain or something. So they bring him back to Spain. And when the ship's passing Africa, he commandeers the ship, takes over and sails back to Florida and shipwrecks on St. George Island in the Panhandle of Florida. But he's back in business once that happened. At the meantime, he's kind of declared himself enemy of the Spanish crown, enemy of Spain, because he's fighting against the Panton Leslie store and burned the store in St. Mark's and also trying to take the fort. So the United States and Spain have a treaty, a peace treaty that establishes the border between Georgia, Alabama, what's Alabama? I guess they call it Mississippi Territory, and West Florida. At the time, before then, Florida included half of what's now Mississippi and Alabama, and even part of Louisiana all the way to the Mississippi River. So the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1795 ceded all West Florida above the 31st parallel to the United States and set the border. And so almost what the border is today, except still extending to the Mississippi River on the west. So Bowles, he disagrees with that treaty because he said doesn't recognize the indigenous people who live on that land and the rights that they have the land to live there. So he issues a proclamation declaring the treaty between Spain and the United States void because it ignored the sovereign rights of the natives. Finally, the next year in 1800, William Augustus Bowles is finally able to force the Spanish fort at San Marcos and St. Mark's to surrender to him. He takes over the fort, and him and his Indian allies and some of his English friends, what they considered pirates, they take over the fort. Now, the Americans, when they tried to survey and mark the border, Andrew Ellicott was doing the work. The Indians harassed the surveyors all the way, so they could only do it part way and had to stop. The United States provided troops, but the United States Army was very large or very small at the time and really did not have enough troops. Anyway, Bowles took over the Spanish fort, and he's there for about 6 weeks till a large Spanish fleet sails up the river and recaptures the fort, and Bowles escapes that time. A couple months later, the Spanish tried to capture Bowles at his town on Lake Miccosukee. They set out from St. Mark's. In a few days, they only go 5 miles. They don't know where they're going. They have no guide, and so they fail. So Bowles and so William Augustus Bowles, he tries another time to take St. Mark's, and let me show you a picture of that. This is the modern fort. You can visit it today. It's a state park, and these are the ruins of some of the walls. There's not much left of it. A lot of the stone was carted off for building part of it to build a hospital that was used by the Confederates. A lot of the stones were taken away to build the base of the lighthouse down at the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge on the Gulf Coast. So Bowles tries to take the Spanish fort again 2 years later from when he took it the first time, but he fails, and that discredits him in the eyes of his supporters among the Indians and the Black Seminoles. And so he's kind of dwindling on the support that he has. The Seminoles sign a peace treaty with the Spanish at Fort San Marcos. Even Bowles' strongest supporter, Chief Kinachi of Miccosukee Town, signs and makes peace with the Spanish. So Bowles, he's losing a lot of credit, but he still has a few cards that he wants to play. So in 1803, he goes to the Creek National Confederacy meeting. The Creek National Council would meet once a year in Tocobatchee Town in Alabama, and I've actually been to that site. Anyway, when he's at the site, he declares himself king of all the Indian nations present. Well, he'd also at the same time had declared war on the United States, and the Indian agent to the Creek Indians, actually all the Indians south of the Ohio, was Benjamin Hawkins. And Hawkins gets enough supporters that the next day they're able to capture and arrest Bowles, and they send him down to the Spanish. And the Spanish put Bowles in Havana, Cuba, in Morro Castle. And Morro Castle is similar to the fort in St. Augustine. Here's a postcard of that. This is Fort St. Mark's and St. Augustine. There's two Fort St. Mark's or San Marcos. This is the fort in St. Augustine from a postcard about 1907. You see the top of the fort, and then at the bottom you see the hot shot furnace out on the green. That was built about 1844. So Bowles, he dies in the fortress that looks a lot like this one in St. Augustine. Well, the problem is that because the Seminoles allied with Bowles and Bowles became enemy of Spain and the United States, it puts the natives on the wrong end again for the next fight. And the natives will make the same mistake again, siding with the wrong side with the British during the War of 1812. But I can talk about that later. We'll leave that for another video.